In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Crestwood Meadows, appearances mattered more than anything else. Perfectly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, and manicured lawns created the illusion of harmony. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, tensions brewed between homeowners and the ever-watchful HOA board that ruled with an iron fist. Among the residents was Daniel Whitaker, a man who had recently retired after a long career as an engineer. For years, he had dreamed of creating a sustainable home, something that not only lowered his expenses, but also reflected his lifelong passion for renewable energy. After careful planning, research, and saving, Daniel decided to take the leap. His plan was simple: install a set of modern solar panels across the roof of his home, reduce his reliance on traditional electricity, and maybe even inspire his neighbors to do the same. But Crestwood Meadows was no ordinary neighborhood. The HOA was notorious for its obsession with maintaining what they called community uniformity. No garden gnomes, no fences taller than 4 feet, no curtains that weren't neutral colors, and certainly no unsightly modifications that could affect the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. Daniel knew installing solar panels might spark some discussion, but he never expected the storm it would unleash. When the installers arrived one bright morning, curious neighbors peeked from their blinds. The workers carried sleek black panels onto the roof, bolting them in place with practiced precision. To Daniel, it was a proud moment, a symbol of progress and independence. He could already picture the energy savings, the reduced bills, and the satisfaction of harnessing the sun's power. But across the street, HOA President Margaret Fowler was fuming. Known for her rigid rules and sharp tongue, Margaret considered herself the guardian of Crestwood Meadows' charm. To her, Daniel's panels weren't symbols of progress, but scars on the face of the neighborhood. By the time the final panel was installed, Margaret had already taken photos, scribbled notes, and drafted her first complaint. Within 2 days, Daniel received a letter from the HOA. It was crisp, formal, and cold. The letter stated that his solar panels violated the HOA's architectural guidelines. It demanded immediate removal, or he would face daily fines. At first, Daniel thought it was a mistake. Solar panels weren't loud, messy, or dangerous. They were environmentally friendly and added value to a property. But when he reviewed the HOA handbook, he saw how vague their rules were. Anything considered unsightly or inconsistent with neighborhood standards could be rejected at the discretion of the board. It was a catch-all clause designed to give them unlimited power. Daniel appealed, of course. He wrote letters explaining the benefits, citing state laws that encouraged renewable energy, and even offered to host an information session for interested neighbors. But Margaret and her board weren't swayed. They argued that solar panels disrupted the visual cohesion of the community. According to them, his sleek, modern panels clashed with the rows of traditional shingles and diminished property values. The HOA called a meeting, and the room was filled with curious homeowners. Some quietly supported Daniel, impressed by his forward thinking. Others, however, parroted Margaret's concerns. Words like eyesore and property value bounced around the room. Daniel left the meeting with a pit in his stomach. The board voted against him, 5-0. His appeal was denied. The fines started small, $50 a day, but they grew quickly, ballooning into thousands within weeks. The HOA even threatened to put a lien on his home if he didn't comply. Friends advised him to give in, to remove the panels and avoid financial ruin, but Daniel wasn't the kind of man who backed down easily. To him, this wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about fairness, freedom, and standing up against unreasonable authority. Late at night, he sat at his desk studying the HOA bylaws, researching state property laws, and scribbling notes on yellow pads. He saw how the rules were stacked against homeowners, how a small group of board members could dictate the lives of everyone else. And with each passing day, his frustration hardened into determination. If the HOA wanted a battle, he would give them one, but not in the way they expected. The idea came to him unexpectedly, almost like a spark of mischief igniting in the back of his mind. If they thought his solar panels were an eyesore, what would they think of something even bigger, even brighter, and entirely legal? Something they couldn't ignore. Something that would turn the whole neighborhood's attention, not just towards his home, but towards the absurdity of the HOA itself. That night, Daniel looked out his window at the rows of darkened houses, all uniform and silent under the moonlight. He smiled to himself as a wild, daring plan began to take shape. The HOA wanted to control his light, so he decided he would give them more light than they could ever handle. And so began the first steps of his transformation, from frustrated homeowner to neighborhood legend. The panels would stay, hidden in plain sight. But soon, Crestwood Meadows would see something that none of its residents or its power-hungry HOA board could ever have imagined. The quiet war between one man and the HOA had just begun. Once the seed of rebellion took root in Daniel's mind, it grew into something unstoppable. Every insult from the HOA, every fine in his mailbox, every smug glance from Margaret across the street only fueled his determination. The more they tried to squeeze him, the more defiant he became. He was no longer just protecting his solar panels, he was setting the stage for a spectacle. Daniel's plan was simple in concept, but ambitious in scale. If the HOA hated his panels because they disrupted the neighborhood's look, then he would transform his house into something far beyond their control. Not just a home with panels, but a landmark, a beacon that no one could ignore. He envisioned it as both protest and parody, a symbol of defiance wrapped in absurdity. He would turn his modest Crestwood Meadows home into a lighthouse. The idea made him laugh at first. A lighthouse in the middle of a landlocked suburb seemed ridiculous, almost cartoonish. But the more he considered it, the more perfect it became. It wasn't against any specific HOA bylaw. It wasn't unsafe or structurally forbidden. And most importantly, it would shine a literal spotlight on their pettiness. If they hated his panels for standing out, then they hadn't seen anything yet. Daniel began sketching designs, measuring dimensions, and calculating the structural weight of the tower he wanted to build. He used his engineering background to ensure everything would be safe, sturdy, and technically compliant with local building codes. That was his ace in the hole. While the HOA thrived on vague appearance rules, city regulations only cared about safety. As long as his project met municipal standards, the HOA would be powerless to stop him. Construction began quietly. He started with reinforced beams in his backyard, bringing in supplies under the guise of home improvements. A few curious neighbors asked questions, but Daniel brushed them off with vague answers. Only he knew the full scope of what was coming. Slowly, a frame began to rise. At first, it looked like the skeleton of an oversized shed. Then it became taller, stronger, unmistakably a tower. Margaret noticed immediately. She marched across the street one morning, clipboard in hand, her eyes squinting at the rising structure. Though Daniel didn't bother to engage with her, he could see her frustration mounting day by day. She fired off letters claiming he hadn't submitted an architectural change request, but Daniel was ready. He showed her permits signed off by the city inspector. Perfectly legal, perfectly untouchable. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Some residents whispered in excitement, impressed by Daniel's audacity. Others frowned in disapproval, worried about property values and the wrath of the HOA. But the construction continued regardless,
reaching higher and higher until it became impossible to ignore. From any angle of Crestwood Meadows, the rising Lighthouse Tower loomed like a challenge to authority. While the structure grew upward, Daniel worked on the true heart of the project, the light. Using his solar panels as the primary energy source, he built a powerful, rotating lamp modeled after real maritime lighthouses. It wasn't as blinding as the ones guiding ships, but it was strong enough to be seen across the neighborhood. To Daniel, it was poetic justice. The panels that the HOA had rejected would now fuel the very symbol of his defiance. The day the lighthouse was completed, Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction. His home, once just another copy in the endless row of suburban conformity, now stood as a monument of rebellion. The tower stretched high into the sky, capped with a gleaming glass enclosure that housed the massive lamp. At nightfall, he flipped the switch, and Crestwood Meadows was bathed in a sweeping beam of light. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The rotating glow cut across streets, washed over rooftops, and lit up the windows of homes. Children pressed their faces to glass, giggling at the spectacle. Neighbors stepped outside in disbelief, shading their eyes. Some cheered, others groaned. And across the street, Margaret stood frozen, her face pale with outrage as the beam passed over her front yard like a spotlight of judgment. Within hours, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Daniel wasn't invited, but he didn't need to be. He could imagine the chaos, the complaints about sleepless nights, the exaggerated claims of light pollution, the desperate pleas to shut him down. But Daniel had done his homework. His lighthouse complied with local codes. It wasn't hazardous. It wasn't even permanent. It was technically classified as a decorative structure. And most importantly, the light was powered by renewable energy, meaning he had eliminated his electric bills entirely while still keeping his solar panels. As days passed, the neighborhood split into two camps. Some residents began secretly admiring Daniel's ingenuity, seeing him as a hero standing up to the overbearing HOA. Others complained bitterly, writing angry emails and threatening petitions. But Margaret became obsessed. She drove past his house multiple times a day, scribbling notes, snapping photos, and ranting at anyone who would listen. But Daniel remained calm. Every night he switched on the light, and every night the neighborhood bathed in its glow. For him, it wasn't just about revenge, it was about proving a point. The HOA wanted conformity, but they couldn't control creativity. They wanted obedience, but he had given them defiance, wrapped in legality. The lighthouse was more than just a tower. It was a message. And every night it shone brighter, declaring to the neighborhood, and to Margaret herself, that he would not be silenced, no matter how many fines they sent his way. But Daniel also knew this battle was far from over. Margaret wasn't the kind of person to give up, and the HOA still had cards to play. The question was, how far would they go to try to snuff out his light, and how far Daniel was willing to go to keep it burning. The glow of Daniel's lighthouse quickly became the heartbeat of Crestwood Meadows. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the tower came alive, casting sweeping arcs of light across rooftops and driveways. For many residents, it was a nightly spectacle, something to gossip about at backyard barbecues or over morning coffee. But for the HOA, it was nothing short of war. Margaret Fowler, still fuming from her earlier defeat, doubled down. The more Daniel's lighthouse shone, the more determined she became to crush him. She wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by a homeowner she considered a troublemaker. To her, Daniel wasn't just defying a rule, he was undermining the entire authority of the board. If he got away with this, others might follow, and that thought terrified her. Within days, Margaret convened another emergency HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Neighbors squeezed into folding chairs while she stood at the front, papers clutched in her hands. She listed grievances with theatrical flair, claims of light pollution, complaints about insomnia, even exaggerated reports of children traumatized by the sweeping beams. She warned the crowd that if Daniel wasn't stopped, Crestwood Meadows would descend into chaos. But as fiery as her speech was, cracks were beginning to show. Some homeowners openly questioned why the HOA had such power over harmless personal projects. Others quietly admired Daniel's defiance and wondered why Margaret was so obsessed. Still, when the vote came, the board stood firmly behind her. They would escalate. The next morning, Daniel received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter drafted by the HOA's attorney. It accused him of creating a nuisance, lowering property values, and violating vague community harmony clauses. It threatened further fines, lawsuits, and even the possibility of foreclosure if he refused to dismantle his lighthouse. For a brief moment, Daniel felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The language was intimidating, the threats designed to scare him into submission. Most homeowners would have caved under the pressure, choosing financial security over a fight. But Daniel wasn't most homeowners. He saw the letter for what it was, a bluff wrapped in legal jargon. He knew the HOA had limited power beyond fines, and as long as his lighthouse complied with city codes, their case was weak. So, instead of backing down, he pushed harder. He contacted local officials, confirming once again that his structure was fully permitted. He spoke to a property rights attorney who reassured him that the HOA's claims were flimsy. Armed with knowledge, Daniel crafted his response. It was concise, professional, and devastating. He informed the HOA that their threats had no legal basis, that his property improvements were entirely lawful, and that any further harassment would result in counteraction. Word of the standoff spread quickly beyond Crestwood Meadows. A local blogger who covered community disputes caught wind of the story, writing an article about the suburban Lighthouse. Soon, photos of Daniel's home lit up at night began circulating online. Social media buzzed with admiration and laughter. People from across the state and even beyond shared the story, praising Daniel's creativity and mocking the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. The attention infuriated Margaret. To her, it was humiliation on a grand scale. Instead of being seen as a guardian of order, she was portrayed as a petty tyrant picking a fight over solar panels. Neighbors began questioning not only her judgment, but the purpose of the HOA itself. Some even attended meetings solely to argue against her crusade, emboldened by Daniel's example. Still, Margaret refused to let go. She doubled the fines, plastered notices on Daniel's door, and sent letters threatening liens. She claimed his lighthouse was damaging the brand of Crestwood Meadows, that potential buyers were being scared off by the attention. But the reality was different. If anything, curiosity had grown. Cars slowed down outside the neighborhood to catch a glimpse of the infamous lighthouse. Children pointed excitedly, and families took photos. Crestwood Meadows, once a cookie-cutter community, now had its own claim to fame. Meanwhile, Daniel quietly expanded his setup. He fine-tuned the lamp to reduce unnecessary glare, ensuring it wasn't dangerously bright. He added decorative nautical touches to the tower, making it undeniably a lighthouse rather than just a random structure. He even painted it in bold stripes, turning it into an unmistakable landmark. The more the HOA fought him, the more he leaned into the theme. But even as Daniel enjoyed small victories, he knew the war wasn't over. Margaret's obsession ran deep, and she wasn't above bending rules to get her way. Rumors swirled that she was lobbying city officials, trying to find loopholes to shut him down. Some neighbors whispered that she was spending HOA funds recklessly on legal fees, draining community reserves in her vendetta. The tension in Crestwood Meadows became palpable. Conversations grew sharper, divisions deeper. The lighthouse wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a symbol. To some, it represented freedom, creativity, and resistance against petty authority. To others, it was defiance, disruption, and a threat to the neighborhood's image. Daniel often sat on his porch at night watching the light sweep across the quiet streets. He could feel the neighborhood holding its breath, waiting for the next move. He had won battles, yes, but Margaret was relentless. And deep down, Daniel knew the HOA was gearing up for something bigger, something that could test even his iron will. The light shone on, But shadows of conflict were gathering. The standoff had escalated from fines and threats to something more dangerous, a full-scale community war, with neighbors caught in the crossfire and reputations on the line. And Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the darkest part of the fight had yet to come.
The lighthouse stood tall, its sweeping beam carving through the night sky, and with each rotation, Crestwood Meadows seemed to split further down the middle. The neighborhood was no longer defined by its pristine lawns or matching mailboxes. It was divided by a tower of light that had turned into both a symbol of defiance and a lightning rod for chaos. Margaret's obsession with destroying Daniel's project reached a fever pitch. Every evening, as the lighthouse lit up, she seethed on her porch, glaring at the glow as if it were a personal insult. Her endless letters and fines had failed. Her attorney's threats had been brushed aside, and her credibility among homeowners was starting to crumble. Desperation pushed her to darker strategies, ones that would take the conflict out of meeting rooms and into the shadows. The first sign came subtly. One morning, Daniel noticed the tower's wiring had been tampered with. It wasn't catastrophic, just loose connections, as if someone had fiddled with the setup under cover of darkness. He repaired the damage easily, but it left him uneasy. A week later, he found footprints near the base of the tower, where no one had reason to walk. Then came the most blatant incident. A rock hurled through his lighthouse's glass enclosure, shattering part of the protective casing around the lamp. Daniel replaced the glass and reinforced the structure, but the message was clear. Someone was willing to sabotage his work. While he couldn't prove it was Margaret, he had no doubt she was behind it, whether by her own hand or by egging on others. What unsettled him more was the idea that the HOA's campaign had escalated into lawlessness. The fight was no longer about rules or appearances. It was personal. Yet, as the pressure mounted, something unexpected began happening. Neighbors who had remained silent started stepping out of the shadows to show support. One family down the block left a note in Daniel's mailbox thanking him for standing up for all of us. Another homeowner offered to help with repairs after the glass incident. Quietly, a group of residents began organizing against Margaret, whispering about recalling the HOA board and demanding financial transparency. Daniel's battle was sparking a movement. The community tension bled into daily life. At block parties, conversations turned into arguments. Parents debated in hushed tones, while children ran through yards pretending to be lighthouse keepers. Social media pages for Crestwood Meadows became battlegrounds of memes, rants, and declarations of loyalty. The once peaceful suburb was now the setting of a cold war fueled by pride, power, and one blazing beam of light. Margaret, however, wasn't backing down. She called in private security one weekend, sending a patrol car slowly past Daniel's house in an attempt to intimidate him. She filed noise complaints, even though the lighthouse was silent. She claimed the light was a hazard to drivers, though traffic reports showed no accidents. Each tactic failed, but her persistence was draining the neighborhood. People grew tired of the constant drama, and whispers spread that perhaps Margaret herself had become the real nuisance. Daniel remained calm on the surface, but he wasn't blind to the risks. He installed cameras around his property, motion-activated lights, and reinforced locks. He documented every incident carefully, preparing in case things escalated further. Yet despite the sabotage, the harassment, and the mounting stress, he refused to dim his lighthouse. In fact, he doubled down, ensuring it shone brighter and longer each night, fueled entirely by the solar panels the HOA had once tried to erase. As if fate wanted to heighten the irony, the lighthouse soon became a beacon for more than just rebellion. During a late summer storm, power went out across Crestwood Meadows. The neighborhood fell into darkness, except for Daniel's home. His solar panels and battery backups kept the lighthouse blazing, guiding residents as they stumbled outside to check on damage. Families gathered on porches, using the glow of Daniel's tower to navigate the blackout. In that moment, even his harshest critics couldn't deny the usefulness of his creation. But the storm also brought out Margaret's ugliest side. Instead of acknowledging the lighthouse's value, she accused Daniel of exploiting the situation to grandstand. At the next HOA meeting,
Her speech turned bitter, painting him as a selfish agitator dividing the community. But this time her words fell flat. Several homeowners spoke out in defense of Daniel, pointing to the storm as proof of his foresight. For the first time, Margaret faced open defiance from her own supporters. Still, Margaret wasn't finished. The more her grip on power slipped, the more reckless she became. Daniel could feel it in the air. The conflict was reaching a breaking point. The sabotage, the threats, the community rifts, it was all building towards something bigger, something inevitable. And as he sat on his porch one night, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across Crestwood Meadows, Daniel wondered just how far Margaret would go to reclaim control, and whether the neighborhood would ever recover from the storm she had unleashed.
By the time autumn arrived, Crestwood Meadows was no longer just a quiet suburb. It had become a stage, and the drama between Daniel and the HOA had spilled far beyond the picket fences and cul-de-sacs. The lighthouse stood tall, blazing each night, and with it came a tension neither side could control. It started with local media. A news crew arrived one evening, cameras rolling as they filmed the glowing tower and interviewed curious neighbors. Some spoke of Daniel's ingenuity, praising his stand against overreaching authority. Others grumbled about light pollution and neighborhood values, their faces half lit by the sweeping beam. Margaret refused an interview, slamming her door on reporters, but her scowl was captured through a window curtain and soon splashed across TV screens. The story spread. Newspapers picked it up, followed by radio talk shows. Online, the tale of the suburban lighthouse went viral. Photos of Daniel's home lit up social feeds, and hashtags began trending. Commenters from across the country chimed in, some hailing him as a folk hero, others mocking the HOA for fighting something so harmless. Memes circulated. Margaret was portrayed as a cartoon villain chasing the beam with a clipboard. The attention emboldened Daniel, but enraged the HOA. Margaret called an emergency board meeting, furious that the neighborhood was being mocked nationwide. She framed it as an embarrassment that Daniel had brought upon them, but residents weren't buying it anymore. Whispers about misused HOA funds became louder. Some questioned why so much money was being spent on legal fees and security patrols instead of community improvements. Tensions came to a head when Daniel received official notice that the HOA had filed a lawsuit against him. The claim was steep, accusing him of creating a public nuisance, violating community agreements, and even causing emotional distress to certain homeowners. The demand was clear: dismantle the lighthouse or face financial ruin. For most people, that might have been the breaking point, but Daniel had been preparing for this. He contacted his attorney, who saw the case for what it was: weak, flimsy, and likely to collapse under scrutiny. More importantly, the publicity meant Daniel's fight was no longer just his own. Property rights advocates reached out, offering support. A local environmental group even launched a fundraiser to cover his legal expenses, framing the case as a battle between progress and outdated control. As the lawsuit dragged forward, Crestwood Meadows found itself in the spotlight again, this time in the courthouse. Reporters crowded outside hearings, neighbors whispered in pew-like benches, and every filing became public fodder. Margaret arrived in sharp suits, carrying herself with defiance, but her veneer cracked under questioning. Her arguments about community uniformity sounded petty against Daniel's defense of renewable energy and property rights. The courtroom became the new battleground, but the neighborhood itself was just as tense. Some residents rallied openly behind Daniel, starting petitions to recall the HOA board. Others, loyal to Margaret, circulated flyers warning that his defiance was destroying Crestwood Meadows' reputation. Block parties turned into debates. A yard sign war erupted. Hand-painted boards declaring, "Let the lighthouse shine," stood opposite ones reading, "Save our neighborhood." Despite the hostility, Daniel remained composed. He never raised his voice, never lashed out. He let the lighthouse do the talking. Each night, its steady beam swept across rooftops, a silent reminder of resilience. To him, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about principle.
The HOA wanted obedience, but he had chosen independence. Then came the breaking moment. During a particularly heated hearing, the HOA's attorney argued that the lighthouse was damaging property values. But Daniel's team presented evidence showing the opposite. Several potential buyers had expressed interest in Crestwood Meadows specifically because of the viral fame. The idea that the lighthouse was hurting the community collapsed in front of everyone. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and Margaret's face flushed with fury. The lawsuit began to unravel from there. Judges questioned the HOA's motives, the press criticized their tactics, and neighbors started shifting sides. What was meant to silence Daniel instead amplified his cause. Margaret's authority weakened, her grip slipping as her campaign backfired spectacularly. By now, the lighthouse wasn't just a structure. It had become a national symbol of standing up to overreach. Families drove by on weekends just to take photos. Online, Daniel was celebrated as the man who turned his house into a lighthouse to fight the HOA. And within Crestwood Meadows, even the staunchest opponents couldn't deny the truth. The HOA had turned a simple disagreement into a spectacle, and they were losing. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over yet. Legal victories were one thing, but Margaret's pride wouldn't let her go quietly. She had invested too much, staked her entire reputation on crushing him. And though the light still shone strong, Daniel sensed the battle was nearing its final stage, a showdown that would decide not just the fate of his lighthouse, but the future of the neighborhood itself.
The lawsuit against Daniel had collapsed, but Margaret wasn't ready to surrender. Her pride, her authority, and her identity as the face of the HOA were on the line. Each night, when the lighthouse beams swept across her house, it was a reminder of her defeat, a rotating spotlight on her failure to control the one man who refused to bow. And if there was one thing Margaret couldn't tolerate, it was the idea of being humiliated. She tried one final tactic, rallying the remaining loyalists. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, warning of the death of Crestwood Meadows traditions. Margaret went door to door, urging homeowners to stand with her in an emergency vote to amend the bylaws. If she succeeded, the HOA would gain sweeping new powers to ban structures like Daniel's outright, retroactively forcing its removal. But the tide had turned. The neighborhood, once tightly under her grip, was now fractured. Many residents were fed up with the endless drama, tired of watching their HOA fees vanish into legal battles. Some had quietly organized behind Daniel, drafting a petition to recall the board entirely. And as news cameras continued to cover the saga, more and more people realized they had the chance to make a statement, not just for Crestwood Meadows, but for homeowners everywhere. The decisive meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a crisp evening. The room overflowed, with residents spilling out the doors and reporters crowding the lawn. Margaret stood at the front, her voice sharp and commanding as she declared that the lighthouse was an abomination and that Daniel had poisoned the neighborhood's spirit. She waved papers, demanding the bylaw change, insisting that without it, Crestwood Meadows would never recover its dignity. Then it was Daniel's turn. He didn't bring props or shout. He simply stood tall and explained what the lighthouse represented. Not just a tower of light, but a reminder that homeowners should have a say in their own properties, that sustainability, innovation, and individuality didn't destroy a neighborhood, they strengthened it. He reminded them of the storm when the lighthouse had guided families in the blackout, and of the national attention that had made Crestwood Meadows famous. He spoke calmly, but his words carried the weight of truth. The vote was called. Hands went up across the room, first a trickle, then a wave. When the tally was finished, Margaret's proposal had failed spectacularly. Not only that, residents pushed forward with a recall vote on the spot. For the first time in her reign, Margaret was ousted. Her face, once the embodiment of control, was now a portrait of defeat. She left the clubhouse that night without a word, her clipboard clutched like a shield, never to return as HOA president. In the weeks that followed, Crestwood Meadows began to heal.
The new board, humbled by the chaos, promised greater transparency and fairness. They cut unnecessary rules, restored community funds, and focused on projects that actually benefited residents. While some still grumbled about the lighthouse, most accepted it as part of the neighborhood's character. What was once considered an eyesore had become a landmark. Daniel kept the lighthouse standing, but he refined it, adjusting the beam so it was less intrusive and more decorative. By day, its striped tower was a quirky local attraction. By night, its gentle sweep served as both a symbol and a reminder that one person's determination could outshine an entire system. Visitors came to see it, snapping photos, and Crestwood Meadows became known far beyond its gates. For Daniel, the victory wasn't just about solar panels or even the tower itself. It was about proving that homeowners didn't have to accept unreasonable control. It was about showing that even against entrenched power, creativity and persistence could win. Sitting on his porch one evening, watching the lighthouse beam arc gracefully across the night, he felt something he hadn't in months: peace. The HOA had tried to silence him. Instead, they had turned his home into a beacon, his defiance into a movement, and his light into a legend. And in Crestwood Meadows, where conformity once ruled, one house now stood proudly as a lighthouse, not just of light, but of freedom. The war was over, but the story would shine on.